Sometimes I look at my life and think, how did I get here? And then I remember that life doesn't come with a roadmap or warning signs. If it did, maybe I wouldn't be standing here for the second time, shattered by betrayal, facing another devastating divorce, and dealing with a level of heartbreak that I didn't even think was possible the first time around. It all started years ago with my first wife, Lila. We met young, fell in love fast, and got married without really considering if we were compatible for the long haul. We were both caught up in that whirlwind romance that everyone talks about, thinking we could conquer anything together. But I learned the hard way that love alone doesn't conquer infidelity, doesn't cure dishonesty, and definitely doesn't protect you from betrayal by those you trust most. Lila cheated on me, plain and simple. Not only that, but she did it with my best friend. My so-called brother. To add insult to injury, she even left me with a souvenir from her little escapade, an STD that was as permanent as the scar she left on my heart. You can imagine the anger, the disgust, the complete sense of humiliation. The double betrayal was like being stabbed in the back twice. Once by my wife and again by my closest friend. And the worst part? They tried to play it off like it was no big deal, like I was overreacting. The emotional fallout was immense. I questioned everything about myself, my worth, my ability to trust, my judgment. For a while, I didn't think I'd ever recover from it. I went through a tough period where I felt like I was living on autopilot, barely surviving, just going through the motions. Then came the divorce, a mess of lawyers, tears, and fights that seemed to have no end. But I walked away with one thing I wouldn't have traded for the world, my son, Ethan. He was the bright spot in a period of darkness, the reason I kept going when everything else felt pointless. Lila didn't want anything to do with him, shockingly enough. She said she wasn't cut out to be a mom and left us both, just like that. I tried to protect Ethan from as much of the pain as possible, but he was old enough to know something was wrong, and he saw how broken I was. Years passed, and I did my best to raise Ethan alone. Being a single dad wasn't easy, but it was a role I was proud of. Watching him grow, guiding him, being there for all his big milestones, that was everything to me. If nothing else, I could at least give him the love and stability his mother never bothered to. And after a while, I began to feel like maybe, just maybe, things would be okay again. Then I met Jana. She came into my life when I'd sworn off relationships altogether, when I decided that maybe love wasn't for me. But she was different. Kind, caring, and patient, she didn't try to fix me, didn't push me to open up before I was ready. She just understood. She'd been through her own struggles, had her own scars, and we bonded over that. It wasn't an instant, overwhelming love like I'd had with Lila. Instead, it was the kind of love that grows slowly, steadily, with deep roots. I thought maybe this was the kind of relationship I'd needed all along. So after a few years of dating and getting to know each other, we decided to get married. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a family again. Ethan adored Jana, and she seemed to genuinely care about him. She'd attend his soccer games, help him with his school projects, and sometimes they'd even bake cookies together. I was happy. Truly happy. I'd rebuilt my life, and I thought I'd left all that old pain behind me. But happiness, I've learned, can be a fragile thing. It doesn't take much to shatter it. And last night, my entire world crumbled for the second time. I'm not even sure how to describe what I saw without feeling my heart shatter all over again. It started with small things, little hints that something was off, but nothing I could put my finger on. Jana and Ethan seemed close. Closer than I would have expected, but I brushed it off. I figured it was my past trauma talking, that I was just being paranoid. I mean, isn't that what everyone says? Don't let your past ruin your present. So I didn't. I forced myself to ignore the weird feeling in my gut whenever I'd catch them whispering or laughing about some inside joke. I told myself it was great that Ethan had a good relationship with his stepmom, that it was exactly what I'd wanted. But last night, I came home earlier than expected from a work event. I'd forgotten my laptop charger and figured I'd just pop in, grab it, and head back out. The house was quiet, which was strange. I figured they'd both gone to bed early or were out. But as I headed toward the bedroom to grab my charger, I heard soft laughter from behind the door. It was a low, intimate sound, one that sent a chill down my spine. I stopped in my tracks, suddenly feeling like an intruder in my own home. My hand was on the doorknob, and every instinct was screaming at me to turn away, to walk back out, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But I couldn't ignore it. My mind was racing with all kinds of scenarios, each one more absurd than the last. I told myself it was nothing, that I'd laugh about this later, that I was just letting my past haunt me. Then I opened the door. The scene in front of me wasn't anything I'd expected. It was Jana and Ethan, close, laughing. My son, my only son, looking at her in a way I couldn't understand, an intense, almost reverent expression. And she had her hand on his shoulder, her face close to his, whispering something. It wasn't what they were doing, necessarily. It was the way they were doing it. The way they seemed so comfortable, so wrapped up in each other, as if I didn't exist. They pulled away immediately when they saw me. Ethan's face went pale, and Jana had that same shocked look, like a deer caught in headlights. For a moment, nobody moved. We all just stared at each other in this terrible silence that seemed to stretch on forever. My brain was trying to process what I'd just seen, trying to understand the why of it all. "Dad," Ethan started, his voice barely a whisper. But I couldn't respond. I was too stunned, too hurt. All the old wounds from my first marriage came flooding back. The betrayal, the lies, the feeling of being completely blindsided. I'd spent years rebuilding myself, finding love again, creating a family. And here it was, all crumbling again in front of me, like some sick joke. Jana tried to explain, but I couldn't hear her. My ears were ringing, my chest felt tight. I turned and walked out, leaving them both standing there in stunned silence. I spent that night in my car, parked in an empty lot a few blocks away. The air was cold, biting, but I didn't feel it. My mind was racing, replaying the scene in my bedroom over and over, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, but no matter how many times I ran it through my head, it only became more confusing, more painful. How could this have happened? How had I missed it? Was it my fault for pushing them together, encouraging them to be close? Or had I simply failed to see the signs? I was still sitting there, numb, when the sun rose. That's when I knew I couldn't just sit in my car forever. I had to face them, had to get answers, even if I didn't want to hear them. I drove home slowly, each mile feeling like it was stretching out, delaying the inevitable. By the time I got back, my hands were shaking, my stomach a tight knot of dread. When I walked into the house, I found Jana sitting at the kitchen table, staring at her hands. Ethan was nowhere to be seen. She looked up when she heard me, her face pale and drawn. For a moment, we just stared at each other, neither of us knowing where to start. Finally, she broke the silence. "Jason, please, let me explain." I held up my hand. "Just tell me what I saw last night." She took a deep breath, visibly gathering herself. "Jason, it's not what you think. Ethan's been going through a rough time, and I was just trying to help him." I didn't think, she hesitated, her voice breaking. I didn't think it would come across like that. Her words sounded hollow, rehearsed, like she'd spent the night trying to come up with an explanation that I'd accept. I wanted to believe her, to believe that there was some innocent explanation, that I was reading too much into things. But the doubt gnawed at me, stronger than ever. "Jana," I said slowly, "what do you mean by rough time? He hasn't said anything to me." She looked down, fidgeting with her hands. He's been struggling. With school, with friendships. He feels alone, like he doesn't fit in. He's angry, Jason. Angry about everything that happened with his mom, angry that she left, angry that. I don't know, maybe that we're trying to build a life without her. Hearing her say that hit me harder than I expected. I'd spent so much time trying to protect Ethan from the pain of Lila leaving, trying to fill that void. But I'd never stopped to think about what he might be feeling, how he might be processing it all. I'd assumed that as long as I was there for him, he'd be okay. I never considered that he might be carrying around his own wounds, wounds that were festering beneath the surface. "And you didn't think to tell me any of this?" I asked, my voice harder than I intended. "You kept it from me?" "I didn't keep it from you, Jason. I just. I didn't want to burden you. I thought I could help him, that he'd open up to me in a way he might not with you. I thought. You thought I couldn't handle it? Her face fell, and I felt a pang of guilt, but I pushed it aside. This was too important. I needed to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. Look, I'm sorry if it looked wrong. I was just trying to comfort him, she said, her voice barely a whisper now. I'd never do anything to hurt you, Jason. You have to believe me. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that it was all just a misunderstanding, that I was letting my past trauma cloud my judgment. But there was something in her eyes, something that told me there was more to the story than she was letting on. Where's Ethan? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He's in his room. He didn't sleep much either. I nodded and made my way upstairs, my heart pounding with each step. When I reached Ethan's door, I paused, trying to gather myself. This was my son. The boy I'd raised, the one I'd sacrificed so much for. He couldn't possibly have betrayed me, too. Could he? I knocked softly, and after a moment, I heard his voice, low and hesitant. Come in. I opened the door and found him sitting on his bed, his shoulders hunched, his face buried in his hands. He looked so small, so lost, and for a moment, I felt a surge of pity, of fatherly protectiveness. But then I remembered the scene from last night, and the anger surged back, overpowering everything else. Ethan, I said, my voice sharp. We need to talk. He looked up at me, his face pale and drawn, his eyes red and swollen. He looked like he'd been crying all night, and for a second, my resolve wavered. But I couldn't let him off the hook, not this time. Dad. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice cracking. I'm so sorry. Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd hoped he would deny it, that he'd tell me it was all just a misunderstanding, that I'd been wrong. But his apology felt like an admission, a confirmation of everything I'd feared. Why, Ethan? I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Why would you do this to me? He looked away, his hands trembling. I didn't mean to. I didn't want to hurt you. I don't know, Dad. I don't know what's wrong with me. What do you mean? I demanded, feeling my anger boil over. You don't know? You don't know why you'd betray me like this? He flinched, and I felt a flicker of guilt, but I pushed it aside. He needed to understand how serious this was, how much pain he'd caused. I don't know how to explain it, he said, his voice choked with emotion. I'm messed up, Dad. Ever since Mom left, I felt like I don't belong anywhere. I hate her for what she did to us, but I hate myself, too, because maybe if I'd been different, she wouldn't have left. Hearing him say that broke something in me. I'd spent so much time blaming Lila, hating her for abandoning us, for leaving me to pick up the pieces. But I'd never stopped to think about how it had affected Ethan, how he might be blaming himself for something that was never his fault. Ethan, none of this is your fault, I said, my voice softer now. Your mom left because of her own issues, not because of anything you did. He shook his head, looking down at his hands. But it doesn't change how I feel. I feel like I'm always going to mess things up, like I'm broken. I wanted to reach out, to comfort him, to tell him that he wasn't broken, that he was my son and I loved him no matter what. But the memory of last night still lingered, a painful reminder that love alone might not be enough to fix the damage that had been done. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of everything hanging heavy between us. Finally, I took a deep breath and made a decision. Ethan, I said, my voice steady. I think it's best if you stay somewhere else for a while. I need some time to process all of this, to figure out what's next. You understand that, don't you? He looked up at me, his eyes filled with hurt and confusion, but he nodded slowly. Yeah. I understand. I felt a pang of guilt, but I pushed it aside. I needed to protect myself, to protect my heart. That day, I helped Ethan pack a small bag and arranged for him to stay with a friend's family temporarily. It broke my heart, watching him leave with that lost look on his face, but I convinced myself it was necessary. I needed space to figure out what to do, to process this overwhelming storm of betrayal, guilt, and grief swirling inside me. The house felt painfully empty without him. Every room reminded me of him, of all the moments we'd shared over the years, the late-night talks, the weekend projects, the birthdays. I kept telling myself I'd done the right thing, that I needed to protect myself from further hurt. But as the days dragged on, the silence became oppressive, weighing on me like a heavy fog. The anger that had been burning so fiercely started to fade, replaced by a gnawing emptiness. Meanwhile, things between Jana and me were tense. We barely spoke to each other, our once comfortable silences now filled with an unbearable tension. I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd somehow crossed a line, that there was something between her and Ethan that I hadn't fully uncovered. I tried to ask her about it, but each time, she deflected, insisting that it was all just a misunderstanding, that I was seeing things that weren't there. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to go back to how things had been, to the life we built together. But the seed of doubt had already taken root, and it grew stronger with each passing day. I found myself replaying every interaction I'd seen between them, searching for signs, for anything that would either confirm my worst fears or put my mind at ease. Finally, one night, I decided I couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. I sat Janet down at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd once shared so many happy meals and late-night conversations, and looked her straight in the eye. "Jana, I need the truth," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need to know if there's something I missed. I don't care if it's painful, I just need to know." She looked at me, her eyes filling with tears. For a moment, I thought she was going to tell me everything, to lay it all out and finally give me the answers I'd been searching for. But instead, she just shook her head, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Jason, I've told you everything. I would never hurt you like that. I love you." Her words sounded sincere, and for a fleeting moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I had been wrong. Maybe it was just my own insecurities and past trauma clouding my judgment, making me see things that weren't there. But that hope was quickly overshadowed by the nagging feeling that something still didn't add up. "Then why did it feel so intimate?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why did it feel like there was something between you and Ethan that I didn't understand?" She looked away, her hands twisting in her lap. Maybe because you're still holding on to the hurt from what happened with Lila. Maybe you're looking for betrayal where there isn't any." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Was she right? Had I been so scarred by my past that I was projecting my own fears onto her and Ethan? It was a possibility I hadn't considered, and it shook me to my core. But even as I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, the memory of that night lingered, a constant reminder that there was still something unresolved between us. I wanted to move forward, to put it all behind us, but the doubt continued to eat away at me. The breaking point came a few days later. I was in the garage, sorting through some old boxes, when I found a small, folded piece of paper tucked away in one of Ethan's school binders. My heart skipped a beat as I unfolded it, the words scrawled in Ethan's handwriting sending a chill down my spine. It was a letter to Jana. The letter wasn't anything explicit or inappropriate, but it was filled with an emotional intensity that took me by surprise. He talked about how she was the only one who truly understood him, how he felt like he could be himself around her in a way he couldn't with anyone else. He thanked her for being there for him, for caring when he felt like nobody else did. There was a raw vulnerability in his words, a longing for connection that broke my heart. But what troubled me the most was the way he described his feelings for her. He didn't call her mom or refer to her as a mother figure. Instead, he spoke of her as if she were something more, someone who filled a void that went beyond the role of a stepmother. I felt a surge of anger, not at Ethan, but at Jana. She'd read this letter. She must have known how he felt, how he was struggling. Yet she hadn't said a word to me about it. She'd kept it to herself, allowing this bond between them to grow without my knowledge, without my consent. That night, I confronted her again, holding the letter out in front of me like a piece of evidence in a trial. "You knew," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and betrayal. "You knew how he felt, and you didn't tell me. Why?" Jana's face went pale as she looked at the letter in my hand. She took a step back, her expression a mixture of shock and guilt. Jason. I didn't want to make things worse. He was hurting, and I thought I could help him without involving you. I didn't think it was necessary. Not necessary? I repeated, my voice rising. Jana, he's my son. You had no right to keep this from me. She looked away, her hands twisting together. I'm sorry. I thought I was doing the right thing. I didn't want to add to your burden. I know how much you've been through, and I thought I could handle it. I shook my head, unable to believe what I was hearing. This isn't about you handling it, Jana. This is about trust. About honesty. You should have told me. We stood there in silence, the weight of everything that had been left unsaid between us pressing down like a heavy fog. I realized then that the trust I'd once had in Jana was gone, shattered by 1,000 small lies, omissions, and half-truths. She might not have betrayed me in the same way Lila had, but the pain was just as real, just as raw. The next day, I contacted a lawyer. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, trapped between doubt and loyalty. I loved Jana, part of me probably always would, but I couldn't ignore the damage that had been done. I couldn't pretend that everything was okay when the foundation of our relationship had been eroded by secrecy and mistrust. When I told Jana that I was filing for divorce, she looked at me with a sadness that went beyond words. For a moment, I saw the woman I'd fallen in love with, the one who'd helped me heal, who'd been there for me through some of the darkest moments of my life. But that woman was gone, replaced by a stranger who'd hidden too much from me, who'd crossed lines I couldn't ignore. As for Ethan, I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to cut him off, to push him away and protect myself from further heartbreak. But he was still my son, still the boy I'd raised, the one I'd fought so hard to keep safe. I couldn't abandon him, no matter how much he'd hurt me. In the end, I decided to take a step back, to give us both some space to heal. I told him he could come home, that I wouldn't abandon him, but that we needed time to rebuild our relationship, to find a way back to the bond we'd once shared. And so here I am, standing on the edge of another broken marriage, another life in ruins. I don't know what the future holds, or if I'll ever be able to trust again. But I do know one thing, I can't keep letting the past control me. I can't keep searching for betrayal in every shadow, every whisper, every glance. It's a painful lesson, one that I've had to learn twice now. But maybe, just maybe, it's a step toward finally breaking free from the cycle of hurt and mistrust that's haunted me for so long. After filing for divorce from Jana, a strange numbness settled over me, a kind of eerie calm. I had imagined that ending things with her would bring a fresh wave of pain, a whirlwind of emotions. But instead, it felt almost like a release. It was as if the tension that had been stretching tighter and tighter inside me had finally snapped, leaving only a quiet emptiness. Ethan stayed with his friend for a while, and during that time, I threw myself into work, into anything that would keep my mind off the broken pieces of my life. I didn't hear much from Jana, except through her lawyer, which somehow made it easier. There were no late-night arguments, no desperate pleas to fix things. Just silence and paperwork. We were strangers now, passing through the remains of what had once been our home. But the silence around Ethan hurt in a different way. He was my son, my flesh and blood, and yet I felt like I barely knew him anymore. I'd spent years trying to protect him, trying to give him a life that wasn't defined by the failures of his mother and me. And yet, here we were, back in the same place, dealing with the fallout of another broken family. One evening, about a month after everything had come crashing down, Ethan finally reached out. He texted me, asking if we could talk. My heart raced as I read his message, and I found myself hesitating, unsure if I was ready. But I knew that avoiding him wasn't the answer. I had to face this, no matter how painful it was. We agreed to meet at a quiet coffee shop, a neutral place where we could talk without the weight of home hanging over us. When I saw him walk in, I was struck by how much older he looked, how worn down. He had always been a quiet kid, introspective, but now there was a hardness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He looked like someone who'd been carrying a heavy burden for too long. We sat down, the awkwardness between us almost tangible. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. We just sipped our coffee, avoiding each other's gaze, each waiting for the other to break the silence. Finally, Ethan cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, I'm sorry." Hearing those words made something inside me ache. I'd been waiting so long for an apology, for some acknowledgement of the pain he'd caused. But now that it was here, it felt hollow, like an echo of something that had already faded away. "Ethan," I said, my voice soft but steady. "I just need to know, why? Why did this happen?" He looked down, his hands trembling as he gripped his coffee cup. "I don't know, Dad. I felt so lost, so angry. I know it sounds stupid, but it's like I wanted to feel something, anything, to make the pain go away." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd spent so much time focused on my own pain, my own sense of betrayal, that I'd failed to see how much he was hurting, how lost he was. I'd tried to be there for him, to protect him from the fallout of my mistakes, but maybe in doing so, I'd missed the signs, the quiet cries for help. "Ethan," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "I wish you'd come to me. I wish you'd told me how you were feeling. I would have done anything to help you." He looked up, his eyes filled with a sadness that broke my heart. "I know, Dad. But it's like I didn't want to disappoint you. You've always been so strong, so together. I didn't want you to see how broken I felt." Hearing him say that made me realize how much pressure I'd unknowingly put on him, how my attempts to be strong, to hold everything together, had made him feel like he couldn't show his own weaknesses, his own struggles. I'd been so focused on protecting him from my pain that I'd failed to see his. "Ethan, I'm not perfect. I have my own demons, my own pain. But that doesn't mean you have to face everything on your own," I said, reaching across the table to place my hand on his. "We're a family, and family means being there for each other, even when it's hard." He nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. For a moment, I thought he was going to say something else, but he just looked away, his shoulders slumping with the weight of everything he'd been carrying. After a long silence, he finally spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Do you hate me, Dad?" The question hit me harder than I expected. Hate him? He was my son, the boy I'd raised, the one I'd sacrificed so much for. I could never hate him, no matter what he'd done. But the hurt was still there, lingering like an old wound that hadn't fully healed. "No, Ethan. I don't hate you," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm hurt, I'm disappointed, but I don't hate you. I love you, and that's never going to change." He nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek. "I'm sorry, Dad. I really am. I wish I could go back and undo everything. But I can't." "None of us can," I replied, my voice filled with a sadness that went beyond words. "We can't change the past, but we can choose what we do moving forward. And I want us to move forward, together." We sat there in silence for a long time, the weight of everything that had happened hanging heavy between us. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope, a glimmer of the bond we'd once shared. It was fragile, barely more than a whisper, but it was there, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed, Ethan moved back in with me. We spent a lot of time talking, unpacking everything that had happened, all the pain and misunderstandings that had brought us to this point. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I wondered if we'd ever truly be able to move past the hurt. But slowly, piece by piece, we began to rebuild our relationship. As for Jana, I filed for divorce, and we went our separate ways. There was no dramatic confrontation, no bitter argument. Just a quiet understanding that we'd both made mistakes, that we'd both crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. I wished her well, but I knew that I couldn't keep her in my life, not after everything that had happened. The process was long and painful, filled with moments of doubt and regret. But as the months went by, I began to feel a sense of peace, a clarity that had been missing for so long. I realized that I didn't have to keep holding on to the past, that I didn't have to let my fear of betrayal control my life. Ethan and I continued to rebuild our relationship, one small step at a time. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension, of hurt. But we were learning to trust each other again, to let go of the past and focus on the future. One evening, as we were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, Ethan turned to me, a hesitant smile on his face. "Dad," he said, his voice soft. "Thank you. For not giving up on me. For everything." I looked at him, feeling a surge of pride and love that went beyond words. "I'll always be here for you, Ethan. No matter what." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over everything, I felt a sense of hope, of healing. It hadn't been an easy journey, and there were still wounds that hadn't fully healed. But we were moving forward, one day at a time, and that was enough. In the end, I realized that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or erasing the past. It was about choosing to let go of the pain, to embrace the future with an open heart. It was about love, about family, about the bonds that hold us together even in the face of betrayal and hurt. And as I sat there with my son, watching the world fade into night, I knew that no matter what came next, we would face it together. Months passed, and Ethan and I settled into a new rhythm. It was far from perfect, but it felt real, grounded in the hard truths we both faced. We started doing small things together again, working on car repairs, taking hikes, and even cooking meals together, a shared routine that felt almost like a balm over old wounds. Each moment of shared laughter, each quiet conversation, reminded us that while we'd been through unimaginable turmoil, we were finding our way back to each other. But the journey to healing wasn't always smooth. There were days when the weight of the past would press down on us, casting shadows over our progress. Memories of that terrible night, of the betrayal that had rocked our family, still lingered like ghosts in the corners of my mind. It took time, patience, and a relentless commitment to pushing forward, even when it hurt. One evening, after we'd spent the day fixing up an old bike in the garage, Ethan turned to me, an uncertain look in his eyes. "Dad, do you think we'll ever be normal again?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. I thought about his question, about everything we'd been through. "I don't know if normal is the right word, Ethan," I replied, choosing my words carefully. "But I think we're building something new, something maybe even stronger than before. It's not easy, and it won't happen overnight, but yeah, I think we'll get there." He nodded, a small, hopeful smile breaking through his somber expression. I could see how much my words meant to him, and in that moment, I realized just how far we'd come. He no longer looked like a stranger, a young man lost in his own pain. He looked like my son again, a boy who had weathered a storm and come out stronger on the other side. As for Jana, she'd moved out of town soon after our divorce was finalized. I heard through mutual friends that she'd started a new job, that she was trying to rebuild her own life. I didn't feel anger toward her anymore, just a quiet sadness for the way things had ended. I realized that clinging to resentment would only weigh me down, keep me from moving forward. So, in my own way, I let her go, wishing her peace and hoping she, too, could find a way to heal. One day, about a year after the divorce, I received a message from Jana. It was short, a simple "I'm sorry for everything" followed by a few words of regret. Reading it, I felt a strange sense of closure. I replied with a brief message of my own, thanking her for the good memories and acknowledging that we'd both made mistakes. There was no need to rehash the past, we'd both moved on. Ethan and I decided to take a weekend trip together to a cabin in the mountains, a place we'd often visited when he was younger. The drive up was filled with memories of our previous trips, moments of laughter, shared secrets, and the kind of closeness that I'd feared we'd lost forever. At the cabin, we spent our days hiking, fishing, and simply sitting by the fire, sharing stories and talking about our plans for the future. It felt like a renewal, a chance to leave the past behind and focus on the life we were rebuilding together. One night, as we sat by the fire, Ethan looked over at me, his face serious. "Dad, I need you to know. I really am sorry. I know I hurt you in ways I can't take back, but I want to make things right. I don't want us to go through that kind of pain ever again." His words hit me deeply. I could see the sincerity in his eyes, the desire to make amends. And I realized that while forgiveness is a choice, it's also a process, a journey that we both had to take together. "I know, Ethan. And I forgive you," I said, my voice steady. "We both made mistakes, and we both have to live with those choices. But that doesn't mean we have to let them define us. We have a future, and that's what matters now." We sat in silence for a long time, the crackling fire casting a warm glow over the room. It was a moment of peace, of quiet understanding, and I knew that we were finally on the path to healing. As we returned home from that trip, something felt different, a sense of calm that hadn't been there before. The past still lingered, but it no longer held the same power over us. We'd faced our pain, our mistakes, and we were moving forward with open hearts, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. In the years that followed, Ethan went on to pursue his dreams, finding his own path in the world. We remained close, our bond stronger than ever, forged in the fires of hardship and healing. We shared many milestones together, graduations, new jobs, new friendships, and each one felt like a victory, a testament to the resilience that had carried us through. Looking back on everything, I realized that life rarely unfolds the way we expect. We make mistakes, we face heartbreak, we lose people we thought we could trust. But through it all, we have a choice, to hold on to the past, or to let it go, to move forward with hope and love. For me, the journey hadn't been easy. I'd faced betrayal, heartbreak, and the shattering of everything I thought I knew. But in the end, I found something even more valuable, a deeper understanding of myself, of my son, and of the strength that comes from forgiveness and resilience. The pain and betrayal no longer haunted me. They were part of my story, yes, but they didn't define it. What defined it was the love I had for my son, the determination to move forward, and the belief that, no matter how broken we feel, we can always find a way to heal. And as I watched Ethan grow into the man I knew he could be, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the journey, for the lessons, and for the love that had carried us through, even in the darkest of times. That, I realized, was the true power of forgiveness. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the hurt hadn't happened. It was about choosing to let go, to live with an open heart, and to believe that, no matter what, we could find a way to keep going. And for me, that was enough.